Billionaire's nephew thought he was untouchable. Judge Caprio proved him wrong. March 14th, 2025, 9:12 a.m., 109 Maple Avenue. Courthouse in Manhattan thrummed with the quiet energy of a city that never paused. Sunlight streaked across the marble steps, glinting off polished brass railings and reflecting in the windows of a building steeped in decades of legal history. On this morning, the courthouse doors opened to an arrival that drew attention before the first word of the day was spoken. A sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled up to the curb, its engine a low, imperious hum. The car door opened, and Alexander Winslow stepped onto the polished stone, his designer shoes clicking with precise authority. At 26, Alex had been born into a world that bent for the Winslow name. His tailored charcoal suit fit like armor, every crease deliberate, every cufflink gleaming. Bodyguards flanked him like silent shadows, assistants carrying leather briefcases and phones ready to respond to any unspoken command. Alex moved with a casual confidence that had been drilled into him since childhood. He paused briefly, straightening his tie, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The cameras were already flashing, journalists snapping photos with practiced urgency, capturing the air in his element. He waved dismissively at the gathering crowd, a half-smile playing across his lips, as if acknowledging their presence was charity. The world, he believed, had a script that placed him at the center, immune to inconvenience, untouchable by consequence. Every whisper from the clerks and onlookers, "That's Winslow's boy," only reinforced his sense of superiority. Inside the courthouse, however, privilege found a formidable counterweight. Judge Caprio, 62, experienced and unflappable, sat behind the bench with a calm that radiated authority. His hands rested lightly on the polished oak surface, his gaze sweeping the courtroom with measured attention. When Alex entered, there was no sign of recognition, no inclination to favor lineage over law. Caprio's voice carried a quiet insistence that immediately cut through the murmurs of the room. "In this courtroom, you are a citizen, no one more, no one less." The words landed like stones in water, rippling through the air, touching every corner of expectation Alex had brought with him. For a moment, Alex paused, the smirk faltering ever so slightly. His eyes flicked toward the judge, searching for the familiar deference that had followed him throughout private school assemblies, charity galas, and family boardrooms. Finding none, he shifted his weight, a subtle adjustment meant to reclaim dominance, yet the effort felt hollow. Around him, the courtroom audience, legal clerks, reporters, and ordinary citizens sat in attentive silence, waiting for the first act of this unfolding confrontation. Alex's mind raced, cataloging every possible advantage: his father's reputation, the family's political donations, the whispered influence wielded in city council meetings. But as he stepped forward, the reality crystallized in the unflinching gaze of Judge Caprio. No nod, no raised eyebrow, no concession, only the quiet, immovable assertion that law and justice were impartial. The tension built slowly, like the first drum beats of a storm. Alex's jaw tightened. He ran a hand through his dark, perfectly styled hair. A nervous breath escaped before he caught it, forcing a relaxed posture. "Morning, Your Honor," he said, his tone casual, practiced, trying to infuse charm where authority had struck cold. Caprio's eyes scanned him, unyielding, as if weighing each syllable for honesty, intent, and the weight of arrogance carried in youth and privilege. The courtroom seemed to constrict, the air thick with anticipation, every sound magnified: the scratch of a pen, the shuffle of papers, the subtle hum of the HVAC, all punctuating the moment. Alex continued, voice steady but eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. "I hope this won't take long. I have other engagements." The statement hung awkwardly. Where once it would have drawn sympathetic murmurs or quiet compliance, here it elicited silence, sharp and pointed. Caprio leaned forward slightly, his fingers drumming lightly on the bench, and spoke again, deliberate, calm. "You will have the same time and consideration as any other citizen, Mr. Winslow. That is all." The smirk returned to Alex's face, thinner this time, more carefully measured. He scanned the room, trying to reclaim control through posture and presence. The subtle tilt of his head, the calculated confidence in his step. But beneath the surface, the certainty that privilege would shield him began to waver. His pulse quickened imperceptibly. For the first time, wealth alone seemed insufficient. The cameras clicked relentlessly, recording not just his arrival, but the beginning of a reckoning he had not anticipated. In that moment, as Alex settled into his assigned seat, shoulders squared, eyes darting across the room, the clash between entitlement and justice became palpable. The courtroom held its breath. The Rolls-Royce, the bodyguards, the social sway of the Winslow name, none of it mattered here. In this room, wealth met principle, and the scales were perfectly balanced. Alex adjusted his tie once more, inhaling slowly, preparing for a day that would test every assumption he had ever held about power, protection, and impunity. The first act of arrogance had arrived, but its dominance was already under challenge, and the echoes of that moment would carry forward, shaping every word, every glance, and every heartbeat in the chapters to come. The formal reading of the charges began at precisely 9:35 a.m., the clock above the courthouse entrance ticking in rigid, deliberate intervals. Case numbers CW 2025-0417 was now officially logged, etched into the public record, an indictment not just of recklessness, but of a worldview that had believed money could shield consequence. Alexander Winslow, seated rigidly at the defense table, adjusted his designer tie and forced a casual half-smile, attempting to project control. His mind ran through contingencies, calls he could make, subtle nudges of influence, whispered reassurances to his lawyers, but each strategy collided with the immovable presence of Judge Caprio, whose gaze was steady, unwavering, and morally absolute. You are charged with reckless negligence resulting in injuries and destruction of property, the clerk intoned, voice precise. On February 21st, 2025, at the 42nd Avenue construction site in Queens, your company's oversight, or lack thereof, led to the collapse of a partially constructed playground. 3 children were injured. Equipment losses are estimated at $100,000 and $200,000. The numbers struck the room with a cold finality. Alex's legal team shifted subtly, leaning toward the bailiff, murmuring reminders of family influence, attempting to thread old habits of privilege through the thin veneer of legal procedure. Perhaps a small accommodation, expedited filing, one whispered, voice low, carrying the scent of expectation long nurtured in boardrooms and social clubs. Caprio's eyes flicked toward them, calm but piercing, and a single deliberate shake of the head ended the attempt before it could take root. In this courtroom, the Winslow name carried no weight. The first witness, a foreman from the construction site, rose with a slight tremor in his hands. He carried with him not just documents, but the invisible burden of conscience. February 21st, I conducted the morning inspection at 7:15 a.m., he began, voice steady but eyes revealing the strain of recounting near catastrophe. Several safety checks were skipped. Scaffold braces were loose, bolts improperly tightened. I reported it to site management. Nothing was corrected before the collapse at 2:40 p.m. His words hung in the air, punctuated by the quiet shuffle of papers and the faint whimpers of the courtroom gallery absorbing the unfolding evidence. Residents from the surrounding blocks were next, reluctant witnesses drawn into the formal reckoning of preventable harm. A woman in her early 40s described the warning signs ignored. Leaning fencing, scattered construction debris, and precariously balanced beams that should have been impossible to miss. Her voice wavered at first, then hardened with the authority of truth. We called the office 3 times. No one answered. No one came. I watched children playing nearby, and I feared for them. This could have been a disaster we warned against, she said, glances darting toward Alex, whose smirk faltered, a subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth betraying his mounting unease. The emotional pivot arrived when the children's mother, a single parent, stepped forward. Her hands clutched a folded coat, knuckles white, breaths shallow but deliberate. Tears gathered at the edge of her eyes as she recounted the moments of terror, the sound of splintering wood and falling metal, the panicked shrieks of her son, 8 years old, pinned beneath a sliding panel. "I saw my baby trapped. I didn't know if he would make it," she said, voice trembling but precise. "3 children, 3 innocent lives, and it could have been avoided. I, I trusted your company, Mr. Winslow." The courtroom fell into a profound silence, the weight of the words pressing on the air. Alex's gaze darted toward her, then to the floor, a flicker of discomfort passing through his expression. The practiced charm that had accompanied him through Manhattan's social circles offered no comfort here. The gallery shifted, murmurs rippling into a collective sense of outrage. The initial curiosity that had accompanied Alex's arrival now hardened into anger. This was not a hypothetical, not a line in a contract or a press release. It was real harm, lives disrupted, equipment destroyed, and trust violated. The contrast between the family's influence and the undeniable evidence of negligence made the tension almost tactile. Alex's lawyers leaned forward, whispering reassurances. But even they felt the subtle pressure in the room, the moral authority radiating from Caprio that no amount of wealth could bend. Caprio's voice cut through the tension, measured and firm. "Mr. Winslow, are you aware of the consequences your actions or inactions have caused?" he asked, calm but with a weight that demanded reflection. Alex opened his mouth, paused, swallowed, and muttered, I didn't think." His words faltered under the weight of testimony and community witness. The question was not just legal, but moral. The air in the courtroom vibrated with the collective expectation that someone of privilege answer not just to law, but to conscience. By the time the witness statements concluded, the full scope of negligence had been laid bare. 3 injured children, $1 million loss in equipment, ignored safety protocols, and the stark reality of a near tragedy that could have been prevented. Alex's smirk, once effortless and insistent, had faded into a thin line of forced composure. The community had shifted from observing a spectacle to demanding accountability, and in this crucible, the first cracks in entitlement appeared. As the courtroom recessed briefly, Caprio's eyes lingered on Alex. No nod, no concession, only an unspoken assertion. Here, privilege would meet principle, and the reckoning had only just begun. The stage was set, and the journey from arrogance to exposure, from denial to accountability, would unfold with every testimony, every pause, every weighty glance in the room. Lieutenant Mara Hendricks approached the witness stand at 10:14 a.m., the polished wood beneath her palms grounding her as she prepared to unravel the thread of negligence that had nearly destroyed lives. 43, she carried the confidence of decades in law enforcement, her voice calm, deliberate, each word weighted with precision. The courtroom felt smaller somehow, compressed by the gravity of what she would reveal. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the faces before her. Alex Winslow, still in tailored black, trying to maintain composure. His attorneys leaning forward in quiet calculation. The families of the victims, holding themselves taut with anticipation. And Judge Caprio, exuding the calm authority of someone who had seen both the heights of human privilege and the depths of human recklessness. On February 21st, 2025, at precisely 2:43 p.m., the partial collapse occurred at the 42nd Avenue site in Queens, Hendricks began, laying a set of meticulously labeled documents on the lectern. She picked up a blueprint, flipping to a page marked in red ink. "These are the original schematics for the playground scaffolding. Notice the load-bearing calculations here, altered without proper authorization or engineering oversight. The changes were made to accommodate a faster construction timeline, prioritizing convenience over safety." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes betrayed a quiet indignation at the deliberate disregard for protocol. Hendricks paused to allow the weight of the document to sink in. The gallery shifted, some leaning forward, others exchanging incredulous glances. Even Alex's half-smile faltered, replaced by the subtle tightening of his jaw and a barely perceptible narrowing of his eyes. He had assumed money could buffer consequence, charm could deflect accountability. But here, in forensic ink and digital record, the truth stared back at him, undeniable and precise. "Additionally," she continued, producing a stack of emails, These messages, sent and received over the 2 weeks prior to the collapse, contain repeated warnings about unsafe conditions. Notice the one dated February 19th at 8:07 a.m. Multiple safety concerns flagged. Responses were dismissive, cursory, or ignored entirely. Hendrick's hand lingered on the highlighted text, letting the weight of human error, intentional or otherwise, register. A mother in the gallery clenched her hands, breathing shallowly, as if each ignored warning had personally endangered her child. Then she played the security footage. The timestamp flickered across the screen. February 21st, 2025, 2:43 p.m. The scaffolding shuddered violently, metal groaning and splintering under the miscalculated stress. A beam snapped, tumbling toward a cluster of children, their laughter and chatter abruptly transforming into screams. One small figure, Ethan Ramirez, 7, darted away with mere inches to spare, his eyes wide, the brush of fate almost tangible. Gasps echoed through the courtroom, a palpable reaction to near tragedy caught in unflinching clarity. Hendricks's tone shifted subtly, harder now, her words exposing not just negligence, but the insidious influence that tried to obstruct accountability. During the investigation, multiple attempts were made to manipulate timelines, to obscure responsibility. Calls came from high-ranking executives, polite requests for professional courtesy, subtle pressure on officers to adjust statements, even whispers of career consequences if reports were not aligned with company preferences. This is the human cost of unchecked privilege. This is why oversight exists. Alex's fingers tapped nervously on the edge of the defense table. The smirk that had accompanied him since his arrival began to fracture, replaced by a tension that tightened across his face. His breath caught slightly when Hendricks described the emails in which safety officers had been dismissed, their warnings trivialized, their authority undermined. Each revelation was a mirror reflecting the consequences of his entitlement, and for the first time, the courtroom observed cracks in his practiced armor. Hendricks's gaze swept over the room, lingering for a moment on the families of the injured children, then back to Alex. "Privilege does not excuse harm," she said quietly but with piercing clarity. "We are accountable to each other, especially when failure can injure those who trust us to protect them. Ignoring that responsibility has consequences beyond corporate liability. It has human consequences." The courtroom settled into a charged silence. Alex's legal team shifted uneasily, the subtle whispering and nodding of strategies now overshadowed by the undeniable evidence laid bare. Alex swallowed hard, a tremor in his lip betraying internal conflict, his eyes flickering toward the floor as if searching for a loophole in the moral gravity pressing down on him. The arrogance that had carried him with such confidence through the city streets and glossy magazine features now collided with a force immune to money or influence. The gallery absorbed the cumulative weight of every document, every email, every frame of footage. The children, the near misses, the ignored warnings, all converged into a narrative impossible to deflect. Alex's protective shell of charm and wealth was no longer sufficient. Caprio's gaze, steady and unyielding, reminded him that authority here was not bought, but earned, anchored in principle and moral clarity. By the time Hendricks concluded, the human cost of negligence had been rendered in stark, undeniable detail. The courtroom felt heavier, loaded with tension, moral reckoning, and the quiet realization that entitlement could no longer shield action from consequence. Alex's shoulders, usually so square and unyielding, slumped imperceptibly. The narrative had shifted from privilege, attempting to obscure responsibility, to truth illuminating the full spectrum of harm. The first fractures of accountability had begun. As Hendricks stepped down, the murmurs rippled through the gallery, the gravity of exposure settling into every corner of the room. Alex remained seated, gaze fixed on the floor, the weight of evidence pressing upon him in a way no legal maneuvering or family influence could soften. The stage was set for the moral confrontation that would define this case, and the journey from exposure to reckoning was only just beginning. The doors to the courtroom opened at 11:23 a.m., and in stepped the families of the injured children, their presence immediately altering the energy in the room. The low hum of whispered speculation halted as they took their seats. each pair of eyes carrying the weight of sleepless nights, hospital visits, and the lingering echoes of fear that February  21st had left behind. Among them, 10-year-old Sofia Martinez gripped her father's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her small frame, tense with courage and anxiety, belied the power of what she was about to say. The courtroom, moments ago a stage of procedural formality, now felt charged, intimate, unbearably human. Alex Winslow shifted in his seat, the tailored lines of his suit suddenly irrelevant against the raw presence of those whose lives he had imperiled. He had expected admiration, or at least polite acknowledgement of his name. Instead, he faced faces etched with trauma, disbelief, and moral expectation. Judge Caprio, seated with unflinching composure at 62, allowed the silence to linger just long enough for tension to thicken, for the weight of presence to press against entitlement. "Mr. Winslow," Sophia began, her voice small but unwavering, carrying across the courtroom. "You promised we'd be safe, and we weren't." Her words landed like stones in the air, each syllable punctuated with the certainty that comes from unfiltered experience. The courtroom shifted. Even the attorneys leaned back slightly, caught off guard by the directness and simplicity of her moral clarity. Alex's smirk, the habitual shield of charm he had carried for years, faltered. His lips quivered imperceptibly, a micro-reaction that betrayed the first cracks in his self-assured facade. He cleared his throat, attempting a deflection that fell flat. I didn't expect." His voice wavered, and he swallowed hard, the carefully cultivated arrogance replaced by an instinctive, unsettled awareness. His eyes met Sophia's for a brief, tense second before darting away, scanning the gallery as if seeking an escape route that didn't exist. The shallow, uneven breaths he took were audible in the hushed room, his body betraying the inner turmoil that words alone could not express. The parents spoke next, their voices steady but carrying tremors of pent-up fear and anger. Mr. Martinez recounted the moment his daughter had narrowly avoided falling debris, the sight of her small body pressed against a collapsing scaffold, still vivid in his mind. He spoke of hospital nights, sleepless anxiety, and the suffocating awareness that the promise of safety, promised in contracts, in permits, in public statements, had been broken. Each sentence reinforced the human cost, the tangible harm that no amount of legal maneuvering could obscure. Alex's attorney attempted interjection, a whisper toward the bailiff, hoping for a pause, a chance to mitigate. Judge Caprio's gaze, calm but unyielding, swept across the defense table. "There will be no interruptions," he said. "The families will be heard fully, without interference. You are accountable, Mr. Winslow, for the consequences of your actions and for the trust that was placed in you." The words, delivered with measured authority, pressed down on the young heir, like the weight of centuries of jurisprudence and moral expectation. Alex inhaled sharply, a subtle shudder passing through his shoulders. His eyes flickered back to Sophia, to her father, to the quiet grief of other families present. I accept responsibility," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Not just legally, morally. I failed in my duty to ensure safety. I failed the community, and I failed you." The words were halting, heavy with the struggle to reconcile decades of inherited privilege with the immediacy of human consequence. He went on, specifying restitution, funding therapy for the injured children, grants for community repair and playground restoration, structured oversight to prevent future harm. Each measure, articulated with deliberate care, was not just a legal shield, but an acknowledgement of human suffering and a first step toward repair. The courtroom felt a shift. Tension remained, but the room absorbed a new undercurrent, the possibility of accountability translating into meaningful action. Sophia's hand relaxed slightly in her father's grip, and she looked toward Alex again, searching for sincerity, for recognition that the words were not just performative. Alex met her gaze, his lips quivering as he nodded slowly, the first genuine connection between those harmed and the one responsible forming in real time. The gallery, previously a mix of curiosity and apprehension, exhaled collectively, sensing the moral pivot that had begun. Arrogance confronting the full force of human consequence, and the first inklings of understanding emerging in the young man before them. Judge Caprio's eyes lingered on Alex, conveying both acknowledgement and caution. "Responsibility begins here," he said softly, yet the weight of the statement resonated through every listener. "The measure of your character is defined not by wealth or name, but by how you respond to harm you have caused." Alex nodded again, swallowing hard, a tremor still present in his hands, but a subtle shift toward acceptance now visible. The confrontation, raw and unfiltered, had stripped the veneer of invincibility from privilege. The human cost, articulated by small voices and steadfast parents, had begun to dismantle the protective arrogance Alex had relied upon for so long. Silence settled over the courtroom once more, but it was no longer anticipatory, it was reflective, charged with the moral clarity of exposure. The next phase awaited, one where acknowledgement would evolve into tangible accountability, and where the impact of confrontation would ripple beyond legal obligation into the very conscience of a young man learning the weight of consequence. The courtroom fell into a taut silence at 2:17 p.m. on March 18, 2025, as Judge Caprio leaned forward, the polished oak of his bench reflecting the gravity of the moment. His voice, calm yet unwavering, carried across the room with measured precision. "Alexander Winslow," he began, "this court recognizes the extent of harm your actions or inactions have caused. Reckless negligence is not merely a legal infraction, it is a moral breach with tangible human consequences." The words landed with deliberate weight, and the energy in the courtroom shifted. Every spectator, every journalist, every family member present absorbed the weight of authority meeting privilege. Alex sat rigid, his polished shoes tapping ever so slightly against the floor, a nervous rhythm that betrayed the first tremors of recognition in a man accustomed to invulnerability. His attorney's hand brushed his forearm subtly, a silent reminder of composure, yet the young heir's eyes flickered toward the families in the gallery, toward the children who had survived near tragedy, and toward the blank faces of those who had watched his arrogance crumble over the previous days. Judge Caprio continued, outlining the sentence in precise terms. "Restitution totaling $2.5 million to cover therapy, medical expenses, and playground reconstruction. Structured community service at local parks and schools to witness firsthand the environments his negligence had imperiled. And 6 months under the scrutiny of a court-appointed ethics officer tasked with ensuring compliance and personal accountability." Each stipulation was both punitive and symbolic, a careful balance designed to move beyond mere financial redress into the moral territory of acknowledgement and growth. "You are offered a choice," the judge said, his gaze cutting through the protective layers Alex had worn so long. "A brief period of incarceration or an extended program of restorative service where you will engage directly with those harmed and the community that suffered. The decision rests with you." Alex's breath caught, a short, sharp intake that mirrored the collective suspense of the courtroom. The room seemed to hold its breath, aware that this was more than legal procedure. It was a test of character. He looked toward the gallery, the children, the parents, the neighbors whose lives had been disrupted by a single lapse in responsibility. His eyes lingered on the small, determined face of Sofia Martinez, and something in her unwavering gaze penetrated the armor of entitlement he had relied upon for so long. "I choose the restorative service," he said, finally, voice steady but threaded with tension. "I want to understand. I want to make this right." The words, deliberate and conscious, carried the first real hint of accountability. A whisper ran through the courtroom, caught between surprise and cautious optimism. Even the gallery, long accustomed to witnessing wealth evade consequence, felt the shift, the beginning of a moral reckoning that had previously seemed impossible. Judge Caprio nodded, acknowledging the choice with the precision of one who understood both justice and human psychology. "Very well," he said. "Your service will be structured, supervised, and reflective. You will not merely perform tasks, you will bear witness, you will teach, and you will internalize the consequences of negligence." He paused, letting the statement sink in. Only through sustained engagement with those affected can true understanding and responsibility emerge. The symbolic nature of the sentence was clear. Alex would work alongside children, teaching playground safety walking the lines of parks he had indirectly endangered, observing drills and procedures he had once dismissed. Each lesson would not only educate others, but confront him with the tangible outcomes of his failures: fallen swings, scarred surfaces, and the lingering apprehension of children whose sense of safety had been broken. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate and electric. Social media ignited with the hashtag #WinslowAccountability accountability trending nationwide. Debates erupting over the fairness of restorative justice versus incarceration. Some criticized the approach, seeing it as a leniency born of wealth and influence, while others cautiously celebrated a precedent: a young man of privilege subjected to visible accountability in a way that transcended financial penalty. Journalists filed rapid dispatches focusing on the unique blend of punitive and symbolic justice, while local community groups prepared to integrate Alex into scheduled service rotations. In the courtroom, the families exchanged glances, some skeptical, others tentatively hopeful. The energy was complex, a mix of vindication, guarded optimism, and the deep awareness that justice in its fullest sense was not simply delivered, but witnessed and enacted. Alex, seated with his shoulders slightly slumped yet eyes alert, felt the first tangible pressure of responsibility settle onto him, heavier than any courtroom audience or media scrutiny could ever impose. By the time the gavel struck at 2:48 p.m., signaling the formal close of proceedings, the foundations had been laid for the next phase, a transformative journey in which accountability would become tangible labor, moral reckoning, and sustained engagement. For Alex Winslow, the world he had assumed would bend to his privilege had shifted irrevocably. Justice had been rendered, not only in law, but in principle, forcing a young man long insulated by wealth to step into the consequences of his actions, to witness, to teach, and to change. The first morning arrived on March 3, 2025, with the bitter tang of early March air biting through the layers of Alex Winslow's tailored jacket. The sun had barely crested the rooftops of Queens, casting long shadows across the half-empty streets. At precisely 7 a.m., Alex stepped into the community center's service yard, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, the chill pressing through his thin gloves. This was not a boardroom. There were no assistants to smooth schedules, no bodyguards to part the way. There was only the concrete weight of responsibility, tangible and unyielding. Alex's first task was straightforward in description, but immense in practice: repair damaged playground equipment that had caused a near tragedy just weeks earlier. The swings that once soared with carefree motion had been replaced by twisted steel and frayed chains, evidence of negligence he had once considered someone else's problem. As he hoisted a section of chain-link fencing, his muscles burned in ways they never had in a gym, and his breath came in shallow, fogged bursts. For the first time, labor demanded his attention and respect. Each screw tightened, each board aligned was a lesson in consequences. Children arrived gradually, bundled against the cold. Their eyes measured him, wary and cautious, some skeptical, others curious. 7-year-old Ethan Ramirez, whose narrow escape had haunted previous court testimony, lingered at the edge of the playground, watching Alex struggle with the installation of a climbing frame. "You're doing it right?" Ethan asked quietly, voice tight with lingering fear. Alex paused, looking at the boy, meeting his gaze without the smirk that had defined his earlier arrogance. "Yes," he said, tone careful, sincere. "I want it to be safe this time." It was a simple exchange, but inside, Alex felt the profound weight of trust long broken and the enormity of repairing not just equipment, but fractured confidence. Caretakers observed from a distance, arms crossed, skepticism etched into every line of their faces. Weeks of privilege had left Alex accustomed to being heard without effort, obeyed without proof. But here, every action demanded validation. He listened as they instructed him on proper safety checks, scaffold placement, and supervision protocols. He made mistakes, missed a torque measurement on a swing bolt, misaligned a safety barrier, but each error was met with correction, and each correction absorbed as a lesson. The frustration that had once manifested in defiance now transformed into meticulous attentiveness, a humility born from necessity. By April, mornings stretched longer and the work more grueling. Rain streaked down in cold sheets, drenching clothes and chilling skin. Yet Alex continued to arrive at 7 a.m., a thermos of coffee warming him briefly before he plunged into hours of labor. Muscles ached, hands blistered, but with each repaired slide, each repainted bench, he felt the abstract lessons of the courtroom materialize in tangible effort. Journal entries and video logs documented every step, detailed notes on screw tension, incident reflections, observations of child behavior, and personal reckoning. "I didn't just endanger playgrounds," one entry read. "I endangered trust, confidence, and the illusion of safety. I must repair more than wood and metal." Community members began to notice the subtle transformation. Neighbors who had once muttered complaints about privilege now observed Alex listening patiently to concerns, apologizing directly to children and parents, and consistently following through on promises to repair equipment and lead workshops. A local teacher remarked, "He's showing up, really showing up. That's different from anything we expected." For Alex, the change was not performative. The early mornings, cold winds, and repetitive labor forged a rhythm of accountability, a practical humility that no courtroom admonishment could convey alone. By May, the work extended beyond mere repair. Alex began organizing fundraisers for additional safety equipment, drafting schedules for safety workshops, and engaging with parents in candid conversations about the consequences of negligence. He watched the children absorb the lessons he delivered, taking care to model caution and responsibility rather than authority. Each smile earned, each laugh regained from a previously traumatized child, felt like a small redemption, a measure of trust slowly rebuilt. Evenings found Alex reviewing his journal entries, reflecting on the arc of his daily labor, and recording video logs in which he addressed the mistakes that had brought him to this moment. In these private reflections, he grappled with the duality of privilege and responsibility, recognizing that wealth could not substitute for moral vigilance, and that accountability required sustained effort, not brief gestures. The repetition, the early hours, the tangible discomfort, all were shaping a new understanding, one that seeped slowly into his consciousness. By June, observers in the community noted not only Alex's consistency, but his willingness to listen, to pause when advice was offered, to defer to experienced caretakers rather than asserting authority. Skepticism remained, but curiosity and cautious optimism began to take root. Children approached him without fear, asking questions about equipment safety and receiving patient, informed answers. His presence became a symbol of restitution, a reminder that mistakes had consequences and that active engagement could bridge the gap between harm and repair. The redemption arc was deliberate, slow, and unglamorous. It demanded early mornings in the rain, cold winds biting, and the physical and emotional labor of confronting failure repeatedly. It was not redemption through public approval or performative gestures, but through the measured, consistent act of service. Each day, each repaired swing, each heartfelt apology reinforced the lesson that accountability was not a destination, but a process, and that true moral growth was earned, never inherited. By the first week of July 2025, Queens was stirring to life in ways that felt different, quieter yet more attentive, as if the neighborhood itself had learned to breathe with a renewed sense of caution. Children's laughter returned to the playgrounds, lighter, more unguarded than before, echoing over freshly painted benches and repaired climbing frames. 7-year-old Ethan Ramirez ran across the sandbox with deliberate care, glancing back at the equipment Alex had personally reinforced. There was a visible change in him, a measured boldness that had been missing in the weeks following the collapse. Parents watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, faces softening into cautious relief as their children navigated swings and slides with trust tentatively restored. Alex arrived each morning at 7 a.m., now familiar with the rhythm of the community, the expectations and the weight of real accountability. His early hesitation had transformed into methodical diligence, each action deliberate and carefully observed. Teachers noted the consistency. Some even approached him, offering insights into child safety, behavior, and engagement. It's remarkable to Ms. Delgado, a local kindergarten teacher, remarked on July 12th, how he listens now. Not just hears, but truly listens. There's a respect forming between him and the kids that never existed before. His presence was no longer a spectacle of wealth, but a study in sustained effort, and the community began to recognize it as such. Volunteers, initially wary of Alex's participation in cleanup drives, began to treat him as a peer in the labor of restoration. He lifted debris alongside them, organized materials, and coordinated safety workshops, never presuming authority but rather demonstrating humility through action. The children, observing him closely, asked questions about construction safety, about ladders and scaffolding, and Alex responded patiently, explaining measurements, weight limits, and the invisible forces that could make or break a structure. With every explanation, every careful adjustment, he rebuilt not only playgrounds but credibility, one tangible action at a time. Journalists began chronicling his involvement with more nuance. Articles described the transformation from entitlement to engagement, tracking weekly progress through photos, video interviews, and community testimonials. Social media buzzed with hashtags like NAR, Winslow Accountability, Building Trust, and Safety First. The public, initially skeptical, began to see a pattern of genuine effort. Comments that once mocked or derided his name now reflected curiosity or measured approval. "Maybe he's learning," wrote one user on July 20th, "but he's showing up every day, even when it rains." Inside the community centers and schools, law and ethics students observed, documenting Alex's work as a case study in practical morality and restorative justice. They noted how consistent accountability could dismantle the illusion of immunity that wealth often grants. His actions were dissected and analyzed in discussions. How early morning fatigue tests humility, how direct engagement with those harmed generates empathy, and how transparency and reflection build trust over time. The students' notebooks filled with observations of subtle gestures, how Alex paused to let a child correct a placement, how he apologized after minor miscalculations, how he absorbed criticism without deflection. Families directly impacted by the February collapse were among the first to acknowledge the visible change. One mother, Marisol Vega, whose son had narrowly avoided injury, approached Alex one morning at 8:15 a.m., voice quiet but firm. "You show up. That matters. The kids see it. I see it." Alex met her gaze, swallowing the words he had rehearsed, and simply nodded. The acknowledgement was mutual, silent but weighty. In these small interactions, he learned that restitution was not a transaction. It was a daily commitment, a lived responsibility. By mid-July, the community's energy began to shift in noticeable ways. Parents began attending volunteer workshops, schools implemented stricter safety protocols, and neighbors initiated discussions on local infrastructure oversight. Conversations over fences and at school gates reflected heightened awareness, a subtle vigilance that had been absent before. Children taught younger peers about the importance of careful play, while adults debated local construction practices with newfound attention. The ripple extended beyond the immediate victims. It was systemic, cultural, and persistent. Alex, reflecting in his journal on July 19th, wrote, "Accountability is not a single act. It's the repetition of right actions, even when no one is watching. The trust I broke will not return all at once, but every day I show up, I can rebuild a fragment. These children, this community, they measure my sincerity more than any court ever could." He recorded the interactions with volunteers, the safety workshops, and the hands-on lessons with children, analyzing each with brutal honesty, noting where arrogance still flickered and where humility had begun to take root. Even the media, once relentless in highlighting the scandal, now documented transformation. Weekly reports described Alex painting benches in the early morning drizzle, guiding children through balance beams, and coordinating safety drills with meticulous attention. Interviews captured the cautious optimism of locals. "We weren't sure he'd change," a community volunteer admitted on July 23rd, "but he shows up, listens, and does the work. That's something." By the end of July, the neighborhood had transformed. Playgrounds were vibrant, repaired and safe. Children explored with confidence. Parents felt the protective thread of restored trust, and Alex's name, once synonymous with recklessness, became a symbol of measured redemption and responsibility. His presence, labor, and humility had initiated a chain reaction. Practical accountability inspiring community vigilance, empathy fostering active engagement, and privilege redirected into constructive, visible impact. The arc was clear. Justice had moved beyond the courtroom, becoming tangible in daily action and shared growth, reshaping perceptions and setting a precedent for what accountability could achieve when fully realized. The sun rose over Queens on August 28, 2025, a late summer morning gilded with warmth and the quiet anticipation of a community gathering that carried the weight of months of collective effort. At 9:03 a.m., families began assembling near the newly restored Maple Grove and Willow Park playgrounds, their footsteps crunching against freshly laid gravel paths, eyes scanning the vibrant colors of swings, slides, and climbing frames that had been meticulously repaired. The air was punctuated by the faint hum of a small sound system, ready to carry words of reflection, acknowledgement, and hope. Here, the story that had begun with fear, negligence, and arrogance would reach its philosophical closure, but not in a courtroom. This time, the lesson belonged to the community itself. Judge Caprio, 62, arrived with the measured gait of a man accustomed to authority, tempered by responsibility. His robe had been set aside for the day, replaced by a gray blazer, and yet his presence carried the weight of every courtroom decision he had ever rendered. Standing before the gathered neighbors, children, volunteers, and journalists, he allowed a brief pause, letting the moment settle. The significance of months of labor, accountability, and observation was palpable in the collective breath of the crowd. Justice, he began, voice steady but reflective, is more than a verdict handed down or a sentence served. It is the balance between holding someone accountable and providing the opportunity to transform, to repair, and to serve. True justice does not end in punishment. It begins there. Alex, 26, stepped forward, the early morning sun catching the glint of determination in his eyes. His hands were slightly calloused from months of manual labor, a testament to the tangible effort he had invested in rebuilding what his negligence had nearly destroyed. At 9:17 a.m., he addressed the crowd, voice steady though layered with introspection. I entered this process believing that wealth and influence could shield me from consequence. I was wrong. I learned that true responsibility is not theoretical or symbolic. It is felt, experienced, and demonstrated through consistent action. These children, these families, and this community have taught me that privilege comes with a duty to protect, to serve, and to acknowledge the real impact of our choices. His gaze swept across the children playing safely, the parents observing quietly, and the volunteers whose tireless efforts had kept him accountable. The ceremony unfolded with a careful cadence, a mixture of solemn reflection and quiet celebration. Parents shared small testimonies of regained trust, noting how their children had returned to play with confidence, no longer shadowed by fear. Teachers described the renewed attention to safety, inspired not only by the repairs but by witnessing a wealthy heir take responsibility in tangible ways. Law students and journalists documented the proceedings, taking careful note of how repeated, visible accountability could reshape public perception and community dynamics. The ripple effects of consistent moral action were evident. Once fractured neighborhoods now hummed with engagement, dialogue, and cautious optimism. Judge Caprio's reflections threaded through the ceremony, philosophical yet anchored in practical reality. Power can never exempt one from moral and legal obligation, he said, letting each word hang in the warm morning air. Privilege is not immunity. Accountability, when paired with sincere effort, transforms not only the individual, but the community that bears witness. Conscience and trust are strengthened when the consequences of our actions are met with integrity, and redemption is earned, never assumed. Alex's expression, while serious, bore the subtle relief of understanding. The weight of the lesson he had carried for months, now integrated into a personal ethic that could guide future decisions. His eyes met those of children he had once endangered, now laughing, climbing, and testing their courage on structures he had helped make safe. In that moment, the abstract concepts of restitution and moral repair were rendered concrete. A swing, a sandbox, a slide. The tangible results of visible, accountable action. The audience, a cross-section of neighborhood residents, volunteers, parents, and media, absorbed the philosophical undercurrent as more than words. It was lived philosophy, a demonstration that justice does not reside solely in legal language, but in repeated, meaningful choices that repair harm, rebuild trust, and foster ethical awareness. Conversations began quietly among groups, observing how redemption could ripple outward, how one individual's effort catalyzed engagement, care, and attention in an entire community. Alex concluded with a final, measured reflection, his voice carrying both humility and resolve. This journey is not complete. Learning, repairing, and listening must continue. I cannot erase the mistakes of February 21st, 2025, but I can commit to ensuring that every action from now on reflects the responsibility that privilege demands. True accountability is never a moment. It is a lifetime of conscious choices. As the ceremony drew to a close at 10:42 a.m., applause rose not merely in recognition of restored playgrounds, but in acknowledgement of a broader moral victory. Justice in its fullest sense had been enacted. Accountability had been met with opportunity for transformation, consequences had shaped conscience, and the community had emerged stronger, more vigilant, and more connected. The story that began with arrogance and privilege now concluded with reflection, responsibility, and an enduring understanding that ethical awareness is as tangible and essential as the playgrounds on which children now played freely and safely.